Hello everyone. It's been a long time since the second part of this video series because of the fact that this is something that some people might find to be quite touchy as well. I wanted to ensure that I did my best to get as well informed about the subject matter before making this video. Because as you guys might know, I'm someone who has worked in the game industry in Japan, and we have made 2 videos already talking about the state internally within Japan. And with the third video, I was planning to do one talking about the state of Japan in the region in particular, as well as how it's doing as compared to some of the other big countries within the game development scene within the region. So in order to do that, there were plenty of things that I wanted to ensure that I did right, and because of that I went around trying to get in contact with people from, well, all of these big companies within these other countries as well. I've talked to regular people from Korea, I've talked to Nexon employees, I've talked to people within Tencent as well, quite a fair bit in fact, as well as people from Happy Elements, another fairly big Chinese company that has been working within Japan for quite a while as well. So suffice to say, I've tried my best to reach out and understand better these companies as well as the industry within the countries that they come from, to the extent that I even went to buy an actual physical book. Look at this thing. Do people even know what this is anymore? Did you know that you could actually put ink on paper and then have people read this to get information instead? It's wow, I know. And because of all of the interviews as well as all of the books I was reading, it ended up taking a little bit longer than expected. While I may have some informational bias from being due to the fact that I would know one of the industries more than the rest, I want to try and get across as far as possible that I am someone who doesn't have any form of like bias when it comes to where a game comes from if the game is well made. And so in the year 2025, at the time of me recording this, which is March the 1st, I wanted to try and see if we could answer a few questions with a lot of the narratives that people are putting out there about the industry and its state within the East Asia region right now, which is part 1, is the Japanese game industry declining? And part 2, if so, are the Chinese and Korean game industry starting to overtake them, or have they already done so? The current state that they're in now, as well as why they have managed to reach the state they are in now. So the first question, right, the Japanese game industry, is it declining? I would say yes, it is, and I feel like many people who work within the industry would also agree. But I would say that it's not as new of a problem as many people seem to think it is, right? Because internet culture itself, it's a lot like that one blue hedgehog that everybody loves to meme, right? It moves around very fast as it moves from drama to incident, and it tends to hyperfixate on very specific things that are happening in the here and now. But to those people, I would say, if you think about it, is this all really new, though, to begin with? Now, that's not to say that the entirety of the industry is just all on the decline, right? There are many companies out there still that are still fairly innovative and that are still able to work efficiently and in a way that allows them to stay competitive vis-a-vis many of the other companies from abroad as well. However, it is also true that many of the big firms that have produced some of the biggest and most famous IPs and series out there just simply don't seem to be doing as well. When it comes to Bandai Namco, I know they're more of a publisher, although they do have a development arm under Bandai Namco Studios. Even when they seem to develop titles in the last recent few years, we do see them failing spectacularly here and there with Gundam Evolutions, Blue Protocol, with the latter title, mind you, taking them 6 years and 600 staff to create a game that basically EOS'd fairly quickly. Gus, one of the studios within Koei and Tecmo, were actually not doing fairly well up until the release of Riser, where, you know, the certain things apparently helped the game to sell fairly well compared to the other titles before it. Nippon Ichi Software, the creators of Disgaea, they have been massively in the red for a few years now. In fact, in 2024, I think from the period of April to December, they actually recorded that they were at a loss of about 27 million yen. Oka Games, which is under NetEase, is shutting down. And while with Bandai and Square Enix, people would attribute a lot of the success of the titles to the companies themselves, let's not also forget the fact that with these companies, half the time, maybe even more so than that, they actually do rely on other companies externally to help them develop the title, right? With both Square Enix as well as Bandai Namco, we do know that they use the Ghost development from Tosei quite a fair bit. In fact, Tosei has been involved with development with Square Enix since the periods of the original Valkyrie profile. So, suffice to say, the amount of development capacity that these big companies have in and of itself may not be as big as people actually think it is. And to be fair, there isn't really any shame with using a external development company. Most big AAA companies do that because you simply don't want to have all of that internal capacity, which you may not be able to fully utilize all the time when you're shifting from project to project. And it's a lot higher of a risk to keep all of these people internally than to just hire someone externally and pay them for the work that is done instead, especially in a country like Japan, where firing people is typically a lot harder, and which is why you see companies like Bandai Namco resorting to using the modern day equivalent of the Lobotomy Corporation isolation chamber to basically force people to go rogue and just quit on their own because of how difficult it is to actually fire people instead. And we do know that both of these companies still rely on Tosei quite a fair bit, because as these companies announced that they were cutting back and cancelling many of the projects that were in development, you also suddenly started to see Tosei go into the red and also announce that the cause of them going into the red was because of the fact that certain works with certain partner corporations got cancelled. However, I would argue that Japan's work culture, that is to say the very heavy top-down leadership, where you basically have people at the top microing what everybody else does below, and the whole idea of the focus on seniority, for example, basically giving all of the work to veterans or people who have been with the company for a long time over people who may have just come in and who may actually have the talent or the will to do it. These things that we have covered before in the first two videos, as a result of all of that, it kind of creates a culture within Japan where it's very difficult for new people entering the industry to actually gain the experience necessary. And as the people who do have that experience get older and older and start to retire, there is this gap in terms of the experience needed, and that might be part of the reason why we're seeing the situation that Japan is in today. Combine this with the more general culture as well, where the idea of getting into a big and successful company is something that tends to be looked on a lot more positively. I'm sure in every single country that is the case as well, but typically you would see that in the West especially, there is, or there has always been, that simultaneous focus on the entrepreneur, the person who will strike out on his own, and there is a little bit less of a negative perception on failure when trying to start a business in that sense. But as a result of this difference in the overall culture as well, that the ways that the game development universities in Japan started to teach as well as train their students also tended to be very different, in the sense that, and this is something I realized talking to people in even Singapore, for example, in the Japan back in the day when the university actually used to be fairly popular and well regarded, that the universities then do tend to try to also give their students a more holistic education, in the sense of also focusing on trying to give them the skills required to go indie if they so decided to, and to focus on giving them the ability to develop a game on their own first and foremost. Whereas with Japan, the end goal for most of these game universities is to actually get the people who graduate to then move on into a big company instead. And as a result, unless you're entering a very small company or game studio, or maybe like 20 to 30 people, for example, most people entering these big AAA firms within Japan, they don't really get very much opportunities to develop their skills initially, and they don't really get very much of an opportunity to develop as a leader as well, or to show initiative, as you tend to be put into positions where it's very difficult for you to then give suggestions to the people above you on how things could be improved as well. And because of the style of management that many of the older companies within Japan have had, these people who are put in these positions where they don't really get much chance to develop nor to lead, they just suddenly, after a few years of working with the company, get told, hey, you have worked with us for many years, you'll be great to lead a team of maybe 20 to 30 people, or even like 100 plus people now. And they just suddenly get tossed into managing a project that is way outside of their skill or ability at the current present period in time. Couple this with the fact that many of the people who initially spearheaded the industry are either starting to grow old, or being constantly funneled into developing the same title or the same series over and over again, and it basically means that the industry is kind of stuck in a situation where you don't really have many people coming up with new IPs. Yes, I know that usually it is not something that you expect of the triple A's to do. Typically, when most people talk about the game industry, you'd expect the triple A's to be the more stable company that basically produces the thing that has already been successful to maintain itself, while slowly experimenting here and there, or taking in other studios, acquiring them to try and then produce something new that would then help to expand the company so that it can continue its endless growth, so that it can appease its stockholders. And you would typically expect the small indie companies to be the ones that do all of this experimentation instead. But the issue with the way that development happens in Japan is that many companies, the majority at least, are typically being funneled into basically working for someone else instead, and there isn't as much of an emphasis on striking it out on your own, especially when you're new within the industry. And the triple A's are slowly starting to basically see the pool of very talented veterans that they have at their disposal start to dwindle. Not so much because of the cripplingly decreasing birth rate, although that is also a thing, but more so because the new generation of people who should have been trained and raised to take the position of the people who are currently the big and successful people within the companies never really happen, as the people at the top would be constantly put in those positions to ensure that it succeeds instead. The dependence on pre-existing IPs is at some point gonna become unsustainable. And as they try to branch out to develop something new, the lack of expertise within the company in developing something new, as well as managing the teams for all of these new projects that they're trying to get into, while constantly having seen much success over the years with its successful existing IPs, basically creates a sense of invulnerability that makes them think that they can actually successfully make a new title just by putting people who have basically been with the company for a long time and have seen work within the company for a long time, and expect that to just be a success as a result, causing them to take on projects that may be highly overscoped and that just end up not succeeding for multiple reasons. Either the quality is just simply not up to par, or it takes too long due to inefficient workflows, which basically means that the project constantly gets delayed, costs keep going up, and therefore the break-even point is hard to reach, or they're just simply not keeping up with the shifting industry trends, and as a result they're getting left behind, as what they think is the standard and what has known to be safe to make all this time may not necessarily be as successful as it once was. This is especially the case with the mobile game space. Being a first mover into the mobile social game space back in the day might have actually also ended up being a detriment to the Japanese game industry to some extent, because while it did bring to them a lot of profitability back then, I feel like it also kind of warped the perception of what would actually need to be done for a title to be successful. And that is part of the reason why, even till this day, because those perceptions have not fully shifted yet, that some of these companies are starting to lag behind China and Korea, for example. Especially from like 2007 to 2015-16, when the technology with smartphones weren't as advanced yet. Especially here in Japan, hell, like people were using feature phones up until 2010. Do people even know what feature phones are? Of course you don't, because it was never used outside of Japan. That was a rhetorical question that only I knew the answer to. Or maybe some of you very cool, like people who know Japanese culture probably know it as well, so I'm exaggerating a lot though. But especially with the generation of feature phones, games couldn't be too highly intensive, and so the level of gameplay that you could put into these games was a lot lower than even for many of the console games out there. And not only that, because of the typical considerations of when people would be playing these games, like with many of these games you typically don't expect people to be playing them hardcore all the time. Maybe Grand Blue might have been an exception, where you really did have raids and clan battles that really did force people to invest a lot more, although that would come a lot later as well. With the earlier titles like Rage of Bahamut, the early Idolmaster mobile games, for example, those you typically were designed with the goal of being something that people could play casually on the train, for example, or on their phones when they were out of the home, and you would typically still expect that people would go home and play games on their consoles. As a result, the much lower quality that could even be like physically possible to present to the consumers at the time, compared to the amount of money that it brought in, basically meant that there were many companies out there that tried to basically just focus more into this space because of the huge amount of money you could make with the much lower investment. And this basically also means that you don't really require as skilled or highly skilled developers to create many of these games. Hell, some of them even were basically just incremental games for the most part, with a gacha built into it, which basically resulted in a generation of developers for whom the idea of producing a highly advanced game was not the main goal. Rather, for this group of developers, were more focused on trying to produce simple, low cost, but quick to push to market titles. As a result, the amount of skill required to be a developer in the industry for a while kind of went down. On average, at least, I'm not saying that all companies and all developers basically saw that dip in quality. It's basically just a part of it that basically was starting to get a lot bigger as a result of the shifting popularity of these mobile games as well. And yes, over time, these games did slowly improve in gameplay. I mean, Puzzles and Dragons, as well as FGO, we might make fun of them now, but when you consider the type of games that were around back in the day, compared to those, these were already a step up, to be honest. And it was only in the later years where you started to see the mobile game industry itself start to step up in terms of the quality of its games.
And where the skill requirements to operate within the sector increased. But the issue is that the culture and public perception of the sector as producing lower quality games has continued to exist among certain people due to the proliferation of consumer console and arcade games, which tended to be objectively of higher quality back in the day and did really well in Japan as well as in the rest of the world, versus the other Asian nations such as China and Korea, where those styles of games didn't get as big, and as a result, it set a different standard for the norms of gaming and what counts as quality within Japan for the individual sectors within the industry. And this, coupled with the complacency within the mobile game sector within Japan itself, where people continue to put out low-cost games with the belief that it can succeed in spite of the shifting trend, it then reinforces that belief and makes it even harder to get big talent into these firms as they continue to believe that they can get by with just the minimal amount of talent required.
Which wouldn't be a problem if, like in the Ghostbusters or in Pissing, we don't just cross the streams, right? People who work and develop mobile games, you don't want to just suddenly cross and just toss them into development because of the fact that for a consumer title or a AAA game, for example, the requirements are very different. The style of monetization, the concepts when it comes to balancing the game, they're all very starkly different from each other. And so you kind of want to ensure that if you're going to toss people in, they're going to want to slowly prep them up to the point where they can contribute in the other sector of the game industry as well. But the issue is that this didn't really happen with many of the game companies, especially the big ones within Japan, due to the culture of both the focus on the belief that someone being senior is therefore someone who's capable to work any of these jobs, and the idea of mobility within the company that used to be a lot more common within Japan as well. Like even with like not even the game industry, for example, with like banking, many of the people who first joined like JCB or other banks, for example, some of them are actually put into positions where they basically go through a rotation of all of the different positions within the bank at a grounds level first before they're slowly brought up to a higher level. And there's this whole idea of mobility and being able to easily shift people around that people have come to expect to some extent, which basically means that people who have barely any experience in consumer game development are just suddenly being tossed in a leadership position and expected to work things out, and vice versa. What one might think, for some people at least, who seem to have this elitist belief that, oh yeah, but mobile and live service games aren't real games. For someone who develops a consumer game, for example, you typically develop something with an end fixed goal in mind, and as a result, things that might work, for example, choosing to focus a lot more on highly detailed models for every single character, well, you could take that idea and try to bring it into a mobile space. The issue was that back in the day, you simply didn't have the ability because the phones that existed didn't have that much ability to process all of that, and it just wasn't as cost viable to constantly try and do that for a 2-week cycle for a gacha game, for example. And when it comes to the balance as well, rather than the game being a complete and finished product where the balance works within itself, you need to make something where there is constantly that grind towards a long-term balance instead, where the game is never in its fully balanced state now, but instead it will be slowly brought into that state of balance as the game goes through multiple steps of releasing new characters, and then you would release new content to destabilize it again, and so on and so forth. So the idea of job mobility and shifting people around consistently can actually cause a lot more inefficiency and culture shock, and cause people who are not very familiar with what they're trying to produce to be put in a position and then cause the product's quality to fall instead. And because all of this has been an issue for so long, like I've actually talked to people like producer, director level people who have worked in this industry for 15 or more years. It would seem like even from their time, they were already trying to speak out and talk about how all of this was an issue and trying to change the industry. But unfortunately, because with the way Japan is, it's a lot harder to get the ball rolling to cause all of this shift in the first place. And my stance is that what we are seeing today is not something that is only coming up now because of whatever conspiratorial reason people are thinking that exists out there for the industry suddenly seeing a dip in quality. Rather, we are seeing the culmination of the systems that used to work when the industry first went to its point of success, when teams were much smaller, right? Things like top-down leadership, it's not like it's impossible to work. And the thing is, many of these things did work back in the day when the industry was just much smaller to begin with, when all of this was just starting out, simply due to the fact that the only people who were really trying to get into it were the people who were highly motivated to do so, who were willing to take the massive risk that it entailed, and who already had the skills to try to break into the market. And as a result of all of that, they tended to work in small teams. And in those situations, a good top-down leader can still get something to work because they don't really have a lot of people to manage. And even if the team gets bigger, they're still typically focused on developing the one project first and foremost. But as these companies got a lot bigger, there were more divisions added in, multiple projects started to move concurrently. The guy at the top of the company is not even directly involved in making games anymore. He's just busy running the entire company, or maybe just chilling on a resort, smoking weed somewhere in Hawaii or something. The systems that brought the company to where it was that arguably don't work as well within this new environment where it's a lot harder for people at the top to just micromanage everything themselves. These systems really worked best back in the day precisely because things were simpler. The tech itself was a lot less complicated. Teams typically didn't have as many people that they needed to manage. And jobs weren't as specialized as basically what you would get from a AAA company nowadays, where you just have so many specialist tools that it's a lot harder for specialists at the top who may not have experience in all the different faculties, trying to then micromanage and trying to figure out how long each of the specialists in each of the individual departments would then be able to do their job. It can lead to information getting lost on the way, or worse still, people not understanding the full scope of the job, how much more complicated it could be than they actually think it is, or that the people at the top might think it is compared to the people at the grounds level who actually have to develop the thing, which then leads to projects taking longer to complete, which then makes the recoup a lot harder. And trust me, when I say that the recoup gets a lot harder, it can actually be to the point that a highly successful title may still not even be able to actually turn a profit at first. The best example I can think of is probably Kingdom Hearts 3, which I know there's some information that goes around out there online about how certain people manage to figure out what the actual sales are. I've actually spoken to people who actually got to work on the title. Basically, if you include the initial conceptualizing phase, which I know at that time fewer people tend to be involved with the project, the entirety of the project took about 10 years to develop. Needless to say, not everyone is involved from the start. Most people probably came in around the 4 or 5 year mark onwards. But the fact of the matter is that even 4 to 5 years, because of the sheer number of people that worked on the project, it actually ended up becoming a lot bigger of a problem, because the articles online that talk about how each of the individual worlds within Kingdom Hearts 3 basically had an entire development team working on them, that is actually quite true. Like, they on average had about maybe 30 designers, the people doing the art side stuff, not the level designer or the balance designer sort of people. Just the artists alone, each of these teams had on average 30 of them. And when you include all of the people who have to deal with all of the gameplay, mini games, all of the different gimmicks, all the bosses and everything within each of these individual worlds, it actually bloats the whole thing quite a lot more. But the fact of the matter is that because of the poor management of the team itself, like, there were actually talks within the team, like one of the planners I spoke to who was initially working on dealing with the game's Xbox compatibility for when it releases. Apparently he had been working in the team since before the trailer even released, and when the trailer came out, apparently they actually added in some content that they were showing off that actually was not even developed yet. Like, there wasn't even actually any specifications that had been planned for some of the mini games that were promised in the trailer, and so he was basically put to task to actually develop all of those right after the trailer was dropped. And basically things like this, where people at the top seem to have a misunderstanding of how easy it is to just come up with a spec for a system out of the blue like this. And all of the different mismanagement that came as a result of the top-down management that caused the project to delay basically caused it to take an additional 5 years after the trailer released. The result, the game in total, if you include the people working on it since before development, 10 years to complete, it sold. And the funny thing is that people online were talking about how, like, it took like 6.7 million based off of their own estimations. The actual number, according to the people I spoke to who worked on the game, was actually that they actually had sales of 8 million. So it's actually a lot higher than the number that was actually reported online by the random people who are about as random as I am. So good for Square Enix. The issue was it actually required 8.5 million copies to recoup, and the team was only promised a bonus if the game actually hit 9 million, which it actually did not manage to hit during its launch period. So basically, a project that did insanely well in terms of sales, it actually made a loss for a period of time instead. And the same thing happened with Image Epoch as well, a rising star within the RPG scene in the early 2010s. In the end, they actually went bankrupt, and the reason that was cited by one of the key personnel within the company was basically the poor management and scheduling, which basically caused the projects that ought to have made them money, or the projects that they were supposed to rotate through and develop, to instead lose their money because of all the extended time that they were taking to develop, because every small thing was getting delayed, and all of the small things getting delayed caused a huge pile up, which caused the game to be significantly delayed, which basically makes a project that could have been profitable at a specific cost or estimated sales volume to then lose money instead on its development. And with Gundam Evolutions, you basically saw a different case where they basically put someone who really didn't have much experience with development nor dealing with AAA titles, dealing with their attempt at releasing what was supposed to be a big esports title instead. And the result was a game that EOS within about a year. That said, I would say that this is in and of itself not necessarily a bad thing, although the situation now is indeed quite precarious. Like, for sure, people are, and it is already happening where people in some of these big companies are losing their jobs, but we're getting closer to the crossroads where these big companies need to make the right decision in how they manage and develop their workforce going forward. Or we might see things start to deteriorate more and more, as what we already start to see is that many of these companies have already said that due to the poor performance of some of their titles, they're gonna play it safe and go back to making things that used to be safe, which the thing is that those may not necessarily be as successful in 2025 in a new market where trends seem to have shifted and people have come to expect very different things from games back in 2015. If they can't manage all of that, well, it feels like they could end up being in a position that's irreversibly damaging for them. However, that doesn't mean that the Japanese game industry in and of itself is gonna just all collapse into the ground instantly as a result of that. I see it more as just in the event that these big companies are unable to adapt and in the end do collapse, it will basically create a vacuum that would allow for the newer as well as the newer generation of developers to potentially try and rise and fill up that vacuum as well. And we're already starting to see some of these changes in the Japanese game industry, although at a very slow pace still. We have started to see events such as the Indie Live Expo, which have popped out that have helped to make it a lot more accessible for people to get into indie game development within Japan as well. Prior to the pandemic, it would have been really difficult due to the fact that there just wasn't very much coverage. You could go to a physical event, but it's a lot like going to a Dojin event with like Dojin games, which a lot of those are also basically just indie games. But the thing is that they don't have the level of reach that these events now give them in terms of a good platform to reach out to an audience that might be interested in their products, as well as the marketing required to basically push these products out to a larger and even global audience, if anything. The Japanese government is also working to develop the Sofu project, which is basically working with an existing incubator program to basically try to provide the mentorship as well as the connections needed to develop a title and to push it to market. Granted, many of the titles that you see there, they don't tend to be super big successes right off the bat, but the whole point of these programs is not just to make a successful title, but to give people the initial first step required for them to get into the industry and develop something. The first few games you make are all probably gonna suck, but even then, you still need to go through the process of making those games, getting them done, putting them out in the market and seeing what works, what doesn't, and getting that feedback on why your fucking thing sucks. And it is through all of these programs that basically many of these developers who maybe didn't really have the ability to do more than just set up a booth in Comic Cat or at like one of the other Dojin events in the past, get better access to people who can give them good advice, a much better understanding of how to make things work efficiently and get it to the market, and also to finally push it out to a wider audience who can then give them the necessary feedback for them to grow going forward. It's a little sad that it's only starting to happen in the recent few years. Like, these incubator programs only came out in I think like 2022 or 23, because companies like Sony and Bushiroad decided that they're gonna make those kind of programs overseas instead of within Japan itself. You know, clearly not salty at all. But yeah, point is now that while slow, there are attempts to course correct as the culture is shifting towards one where bit by bit these kind of smaller scale projects and teams and companies can actually get more of an accessibility to a way for them to build up experience and get their products to market. And hopefully over time we'll start to see that as all of these smaller firms, even the ones that used to make products for the bigger companies, as they start to strike it out on their own and make their own games as well, it will lead towards a culture where people will start to see going indie as something that is more viable and that might actually in the future encourage even more independent and creative thinking within the industry as people move into these smaller groups instead and therefore have to try and find ways to develop something new rather than going into just the big companies and just mindlessly creating a sequel to the thing that has a sequel towards sequel towards sequel. If the right environment can be cultivated, if these big companies can actually learn from their past mistakes and understand what fundamental issues they have and try to course correct, and if the systems and culture that's slowly starting to build up actually does allow for a higher proliferation of smaller indie as well as just game development firms in general, then we might still see the industry struggle for a little while, but we might see it eventually get back on track and maybe be a big competitor within the region, maybe even globally as well again. Now, I feel like we've talked at length about the Japanese game industry quite a fair bit in the last two videos, and to some extent with the first half of this video as well. So now I would like to go into the second half of this video, which is where we're going to be talking about the Chinese as well as the Korean game industry, and whether or not they have actually overtaken the Japanese game industry, and if so, is this actually a recent thing and all by how much? And we'll start off with Korea first, because to be honest, for me at least, I do have a soft spot for Korean games as well. To me, the answer to this question is that, well, to be honest, if you've been looking at the Korean game industry over the last 20 years, I would say that they kind of have already been overtaking the Japanese game industry in certain spaces. And if there are any people out there who tell you that this is only a recent occurrence, that Korean games are only starting to rise up now, they either really have just never looked at the Korean game industry over the past 20 years, or they're the kind of elitists who think that there are only specific genres of games which they like can be considered actual games and other games don't consider or don't count as those at all. Because for me, some of the games that actually left a very long-lasting impression on me were actually Korean games. Games such as Ragnarok Online, Granado Espada, Terra, O2 Gem, hell, the elves in Lineage 2, they actually did as a kid make me feel a little funny inside at times. You had games like Maple Story, right? DJ Max, Audition. There were plenty of games that came out of Korea. Although, for those of you who know Korean games, you probably listen to those and you probably see a trend in the type of games I'm talking about. And for those who don't or are surprised that those are actually Korean games for some reason, yeah, Korea actually made quite a lot of games, and arguably some of the aesthetics or styles of games that people seem to attribute to Japan actually were more popular in Korea, and they were actually popular enough that, like Ragnarok Online, for example, they were in the end brought over to Japan from Korea. That said, the evolution of games in Korea was very different from within Japan, where with Japan, while most companies were basically trying to avoid the PC like the bubonic plague, within Korea, they kind of embraced it, although maybe not in the way that people in the West might think, because it wasn't the case that everybody basically had a PC at home to game. Rather, it was actually more of a social thing, the whole idea of gaming back in Korea in the earlier days. This book, which I actually was talking about before, Mobile Gaming in Asia, which actually goes through a lot more than just mobile gaming, to be honest, because it actually details a fair bit of the writer's actual own research into the history of gaming within Korea, and it also goes through some of his memoirs talking to people within Korea about their experiences with gaming in the past. And indeed, for me as well, I decided to reach out to some people within Korea to ask them more about it as well. And one thing that I came to the understanding of was that within Korea, gaming was considered more, especially in the earlier days, of a social thing where instead of sitting at home alone turning into a fat kid like trying to grind balls in World of Warcraft or something, you actually went to places called PC bangs, which are, for those who are wondering what that is no, it's not me mispronouncing the word. That's how it's supposed to be pronounced. I think you can think of it as a LAN shop or a cyber cafe, whatever word they use where you came from. Anyway, the idea of going to these places and playing together with others, or going to these places with friends and playing together, right? Like you go together as a team and you just play like Dota and then scream at each other while you're gaming together. Or perhaps you go there to play and like interact with others as well. That was more a part of the whole gaming culture there. And the importance of social interaction also resulted in the levels of competitiveness people felt when playing games being a lot higher. Levels of competitiveness people felt when playing games being a lot higher, which is why you see that the whole idea of the esports scene to begin with started out with StarCraft within Korea. And when I was working in Gang Ho Online Entertainment, which was the company that also brought Ragnarok Online to Japan, my boss within Japan was actually Korean as well. And he used to explain to us how in Korea, the idea of like FOMO and competitiveness is actually a lot higher than in Japan. So, for example, if you were making a mobile game, if you were to release a pack for sale, for example, the propensity for people to buy it is much higher simply because the idea of competition and not losing out to others, especially in a game where you can actually feel some level of skill and competition within it, leads to people being willing to spend even more for that social aspect of competition, or the interaction and the type of interactions that they can elicit from people by being good at the game as well. There were also historical reasons for why console games never really took off within Korea as well, such as the fact that until 1988, most Japanese cultural products, which include games and consoles and the like, were banned from being imported into the country. And even from 1988 till the mid-1990s, all of these were still very heavily taxed. So the number of people who have gotten exposure to all of this would have been a lot lower initially. Smartphones obviously weren't a thing yet. Maybe for you Zoomers out there, it may not be as obvious. You might think that like people were born with like a smartphone in their hand from the moment they come out of their mom's womb or something, but that wasn't the case. And so it stands to reason that in a country where at the time mobile gaming had not yet become much of a thing, and where consoles were heavily restricted, that when it came to the boom of the gaming scene, it would happen within the PC space instead. And I also get that those games have been around for a long time, like the genre of MMOs. Like many people from the West will probably remember games such as RuneScape or Habbo Hotel more, right? I know too. Right, I used to play Habbo Hotel a little bit as a kid. I remember scamming people with my friend when we do like falling furniture scams on others. I was a bad kid back in the day, you can kind of tell. But yeah, when we look at the East back during the early 2000s, yes, Japan did have some MMOs at the time. FF11 was fairly big. There was also Phantasy Star Online, and personally, I actually did enjoy the level of customizability that game had. But the fact of the matter is that when it comes to all of these MMOs in general, you do tend to see that the biggest volume of them, and some of the ones with the highest quality, do actually come out from Korea, especially back in those days. And to the elitist people who are like, oh yeah, but live service games aren't real games. Bro, those games have been around for a pretty long time, and have you seen the type of music that came out of these games back in the day? Have you seen the type of gameplay that they had? They actually were really pretty well designed MMOs out there in many different ways. Like, look at the graphics in games like Lineage 2 back when that released. Look at the music in games like Granado Espada. That game has a longer soundtrack than most RPG games out there. And even if we were to entertain these people's delusions that those games weren't actually real games, if you were to look at like console as well as consumer titles in general, you would see that actually Korea did actually come out with some pretty fun titles as well. Kingdom Under Fire, an RTS series that basically was released on consoles like the Xbox, where it basically became a action game slash RTS where you had to command a hero and fight in battles while also sending battalions around to attack and flank the enemy. That was made by a Korean company back in 2004-05. 99 Nights, the game that led to the funny guy on the internet going,
1 million troops. 1 million troops. Wow.
That was also co-developed by a Korean and a Japanese company. Hell, even when you talk about the RPG scene, games like Astonisher Story, as well as the War of Genesis. I think that is the translation for this game's name. It's a fairly old game, so apologies if I'm getting the English name wrong. Those games came out in 1994 and 1995 respectively, alright? So Korea has been around, has been producing many really good games for a long time. You could say that the scale of some of these games just simply weren't as big Like, you could say that, like, yeah, but like they didn't really produce a RPG game on the scale of like Final Fantasy back in the day. But we have to remember that unlike in Japan, where this was the mainstay and most popular style of games for a long time, within Korea, the initial, what was considered like the popular genres within the country were very different. And live service games, even till this day for that matter, like the developers of Lies of P have come out and talked about how difficult it is to release a consumer title even in this day, because people still really want live service titles more there. It would be understandable that these games simply wouldn't get as massive in scale because there isn't really that desire or that shift to want to invest in it back in the day. But in the spaces where Korea's main focus has been, where most of its people wanted, the type of games that people wanted to play the most, you do see them actually being quite ahead of like countries like Japan in those spaces, if anything. So rather than saying that Korea came out of nowhere and is starting to pull out ahead of Japan nowadays, I would say that especially in the live service, like mobile game scene, it was more of an eventuality that they would do better because of the fact that the Japanese mobile game scene evolved in a very different way from the concept of how live service is perceived within Korea. Within Japan, initially it was seen, at least for the people working in the industry, as this thing where you really didn't need to put a lot of money or effort in and it could print a shit ton of money if it does well. But with Korea, because of the fact that live service used to be the big thing, and more in the PC space of course, and because of the fact that quality was actually a focal point for the competitiveness of these games, because everybody was competing in there. You can't just make slop and hope for it to do extremely well because everybody was making the same type of game. So the mentality that they had when coming into the mobile game space ended up fitting a lot better and being a lot more efficient with what the modern social game or like mobile gaming space is. Like, people may think that like this is a space where, oh, you just make slop and people will just roll for like Guna waifus and you earn a shit ton of money, but that actually isn't really the case. You have stories like with what happened with Trickle Revive, for example, a game where initially it was quite poorly received as a auto chess clone sort of game. But instead of doing the Japanese game company thing, which was what Square Enix would have done at the time, which is to just let it go out into the market, release for a year, EOS it and pocket the money and move on to the next title, the person who created the game actually made the, in my perspective at least, looking at it from someone who isn't from Korea, the very wild decision to basically say, you know what, we're gonna use one of the artists that we actually hired to do the promotional comics for this thing, we're gonna, since their art style is very popular, base the whole game and remake it around their art style. And they re-released a new auto chess-ish style game, and it was still kind of very shit. It didn't do very well either, but in spite of the fact that the title tried to release twice and failed twice, instead of then calling it quits, he decided to just call it a beta, go back to the drawing board and redevelop the game. And in the process of doing all of this, the guy basically sold his house to fund the entire development of this project as well. For the sake of getting a mobile game or a social like live service game off the drawing board and actually developing the game, to me that actually sounds like a massive gamble and something that I feel like Japanese companies would never even dream of doing, right? We have seen like stories of this when it comes to indie titles with like Cuphead, for example. But the thing is that typically you don't see this happen with live service games in the public eye as much. People don't talk about how these games usually end up with people willing to take these massive risks just to get them made. And I feel like stories like this, where the guy was willing to stake pretty much everything he had, all the time as well for that matter, to basically release just that one title, goes to show how different the way that people within Korea actually perceive this industry as compared to how we do in Japan, for example. And it leads then to why they would be doing a lot better now in an era where quality in terms of the full package of the game, and we do see this to some extent with the styles of games that did come out of Korea back in the initial wave when Korean mobile games starting to pick up speed, right? Games like Epic 7, Counter-Strike, you do see games that lean more in the PvP direction instead. In Japan, typically most games, they prefer to release what we within the industry here would call a bonsai game, which is more close in semblance to what most modern titles are, where the focus on the game, a lot like with games like Genshin, for example, games like FGO, right? The focus is on just hyper raising your favorite character to be super strong, or just playing the game freely. You literally like a person, like a nerd in the garden, trying to craft the perfect bonsai tree with the perfect thin like wooden shafts that you like stroke off or whatnot. Unlike those, the Korean game industry initially came in with something that was very refreshing in a way, both in terms of the type of gameplay, which attracted a very different audience into the space, as well as with the quality of the game. So with the ultimate abilities within Epic 7, you kind of had something that was very different in the sense that I think up until maybe Princess Connect release, you didn't really have a game that did like the full animation style, more grand scale, like special abilities and the like. Yeah, you kind of had the noble phantasms within something like FGO, for example, but even those, they typically at the start at least tended to use the in-game character models rather than animating completely new scenes just for these in that sense. And so when these Korean games came in with their very different style of storytelling from Japanese games, and when they came in with all of these different styles of gameplay, a slightly higher budget in terms of the amount of effort and quality they're putting into the game itself, it's to be no surprise that as they found their bearings within the space and developed more and more, that it would start to actually overtake Japan in many ways in this current day and age. Like when you look at something like Nikkei, for example, it's up there. Like it really is very high up there and has pulled past many Japanese games at this point as well. That said though, has it overtaken the Japanese game industry though? Well, here are the top games that came out in 2024. Here is 2023. You can pause the video if you want to watch it. I'm just gonna put them here and just go through them all. This is 2022. And here's 2019 when Epic 7 initially came out. There are a few takeaways here, right? There are more Korean titles in the top grossing games. There are still new Japanese games entering that list. And the thing is that most of the old big Japanese games are still fairly close to the top of the list. What we can see is that Korea's successes now are a lot greater than their successes in the past. But for the Limbus fans who are wondering or distraught that you don't see your game here, we don't have their numbers in this space because of the fact that they do get a fair amount of it from the PC client, which we can't actually track the data that comes out from the PC client since it goes through Steam instead. But yes, we do see that Nikkei has actually overtaken Puzzles and Dragons in its yearly sales. In the successful Japanese titles that came out within the time, with like Heaven Burns Red as well as Memento Mori, they didn't come anywhere close to Nikkei, nor even with like Blue Archive in its later years. Although we do see that with the Gakuen Idolmaster that came out in Japan last year, it did actually get to 88% of Blue Archive's initial first year sales within its first 6 months. So it's actually doing fairly decently well. We'll have to see because the data for a full year isn't out yet since it hasn't been that long since the game released. But Korea has become a much more significant force in the field, and I feel like if things continue to go on the current pace and they continue to do well, we could eventually see them actually overtaking Japan in the future. However, while they have come close, the sweep that some people like to think about, like the memes out there about how like Japan makes no new games and like everything is coming from Korea and China, well, it's kind of true. You don't really see as many big Japanese titles coming out globally because many of the titles don't even get a localization to begin with. So to say that there are none is a little bad faith in a sense, because those games actually top numbers even though they don't even have that global reach yet. And what we do see is that the Japanese game industry is probably fairly bit saturated as well, since you already do have some fairly big titles that have been up there and are still up there. And you could argue that as a result, it's a lot harder to basically poach people out from those games to play your games, especially with the mentality that the development has within Japan. And even with the consumer space, because, you know, there are a lot of people within Japan who really do half the copium of oh yeah, but, you know, we are still the best consumer game makers. We make Zelda, we make whatever the fuck, like Final Fantasy and all of that, so therefore we're at the top. Titles coming out of Korea, I know some of the companies that are basically releasing some of these titles are basically like very massive companies as well. So for like titles like Dave the Diver, for example, that isn't exactly indie, although the team that made it is basically a small sub team within Nexon who apparently don't even work directly for Nexon anymore. They're now a subsidiary. So there's a lot of questionable things there, but you do have games like Lobotomy Corporation, right? Lies of P, that actually did so well that it actually pulled Neoverse, the company that published it, out from actually making a loss for the 1 year that the game was around. Stellar Blade, Sanabi, there were so many good games coming out of there. And it does seem like there has been an increase, an uptick in the number of good consumer games that are coming out of Korea. And because they are reaching a global audience, there is now less of a reliance on following the trends within Korea for a game to succeed. And that could actually cause the market for consumer title development within Korea to thrive as well. Because even if the local market very much prefers their live service games, you can still produce a consumer title now and get it to succeed overseas. And so, with current pace, as people seem to get more and more interested in Korean consumer titles as well, I feel like it is very possible for them to, given a few more years, to actually get more invested in the space, for companies to be willing to invest more into this, into the tools, the teams needed to develop consumer titles. I could see them actually becoming a force within the space as well. That said, however, pointing to the specific titles, like all of the ones I mentioned, like Salaryman and alike, and saying that therefore the Korean industry is successful, is a little disingenuous, right? It's not fair to say that, like, because we have seen successful titles, the whole industry is doing well. Because when we look at the big three N's in Korea, no, that's not some kind of racist thing or something. It's representative of the three big game companies there, Nexon, NCSoft, and Netmarble. We do see that there are massive layoffs that are happening within these companies within recent years. Companies simply unable to continue to grow at the same pace that they have been till now. Even with NeoWiz, which published Lies of P, and who basically are the parent company of the developers who created that game. Aside from the year where Lies of P came out, there is kind of a very, very not too good performance going on. And a part of this could be attributed to the fact that the whole like live service side of development simply isn't as profitable as it used to be anymore. Where and this I feel like doesn't just apply to Korea, but to also to Japan and to some extent like China as well, where because of the fact that these games actually do focus a lot on getting people to play and log in daily, the more of these games come out, the harder it is for people to manage like playing every single game. And the market to some extent has reached a level of saturation. Because unlike with a consumer title, you can't just say like, oh yeah, I'm gonna play game A now, and then when I'm done with game A, I'm gonna play game B, maybe like in a week or two later, because these games have no end. And so the industry has reached a point where there's a lot more money that needs to be put into marketing, into all of the tertiaries that aren't just a game, to basically keep your DAU high, keep people retained and playing your game. And as a result, the costs have gone up exponentially. And even if revenues continue to increase, total costs incurred to expand to increase that revenue is actually reaching the point where it's outstripping the growth in revenue. And so we are seeing that these companies are starting to suffer from losses as a result. Hence, the market, I won't say it's in the best spot, and whether or not it will be able to do well in the future really depends on how well these big companies manage. Like it feels in a way like the more I looked into the Korean game industry, it reminds me a lot of Japan to some extent. Yeah, we kind of went in a very different direction initially, and so the challenges, the ways the industries develop were kind of different, but in a way both have reached the same crossroads of the big companies at the top aren't doing very well. I'm sure people globally can relate to that to some extent as well, where they have continued to grow and grow to the point where realistically it's not very sustainable for them to constantly invest more and more into the whole live service space. Or at least if they do plan to, there needs to be a shift in the way that they operate within the space, be it in finding more cost-effective ways to release and maintain a title's popularity, or to just outright reduce the total number of titles and focus on a select few to basically ensure that these titles can basically stay competitive in the market rather than having multiple titles that you release yourself and that just cannibalize each other out in the market and therefore make each individual one less profitable, and that ruin your company's image as one that you can rely on to have long-lasting games when you release 10 and maybe like 5 of your games get killed by the other 5 instead.
This might allow them to ensure that the quality of the individual titles can be maintained and that they can focus on providing a unique experience to get over the criticism some of them face about their games being too similar feeling, or with some of them it feeling like complete slop within their home country, which through the creation of something that will be unique even within their home country where things are starting to feel boring, it feels like it would allow them to then create something that will be even more unique and competitive in the global market as well.
But that said, we do see that the industry there is starting to ramp up consumer title production, and it seems to be doing well for them. And we do see that with the live service titles as well, they are trying to go through more different functions and methods to try to get their game to go popular globally instead. We'll have to wait and see how the industry continues to develop. Within Korea, especially among the consumers, there does seem to be some level of pessimism about the industry itself. But it's not something that they can't correct, and it's not something that they can't improve. And I feel like if the Korean industry manages to make the pivot towards consumer titles, if they manage to find the right ways to if they manage to find ways to make live service games even more sustainable or profitable so that they can continue to manage them for long without sacrificing too much of the quality, I can see them actually continuing to stay on track to doing well within these spaces and eventually outstripping Japan in some of them. Meanwhile, when we look at China's game industry, we do see a marked improvement over the last few years, although is that improvement really that sudden? Or do we just never really have proper access to the game industry there due to the fact that most information doesn't really get out of the country very well to actually fully grasp how the industry had evolved over the years? After speaking to some people from Tencent, from NetEase, from Happy Elements, as well as some of the research I've been doing myself, I would have to say that it's a little bit of a mix of both, although maybe with a little bit more of emphasis on the latter instead. In the year 2000, the year where people with a dent in their brain were expecting the world to suddenly end, for Chinese gamers, in a sense, it partially was ended because of the fact that the importing of video game consoles was basically banned by the government there. And they also put in massive restrictions on arcades as well as internet cafes within the country. Even prior to the 2000s though, they were already putting massive tariffs on most of these things entering the country, with consoles basically having a tax of about 130%, which basically drove away many console creators from trying to sell their products within China. According to a producer from Happy Elements that I talked to in February, he was mentioning how this is something that actually kind of happens cyclically in China, where they would basically allow in a bunch of tech new things to come into the country, let it come in unfettered, and then after a while basically put in a lot of these tax and restrictions to basically drive out all of the foreign companies that had initially brought in this tech. And then they would repeat this cycle over and over so as to allow the tech to enter, and then for companies within the country to study the tech and create their own versions of it. Some people are probably gonna argue and say like, no, that's not what's happening, there's no way, but we know, even people within the Chinese game industry all know that this kind of is a thing that happens. Either way, as a result, the biggest console that was selling locally at the time was something called the Xiao Ba Wang, which was designed as a studying tool slash NES, which was basically just an excuse to basically say, this is an NES, please fucking government don't do anything to ban this thing that we're making locally as well. But because of the fact that the thing was basically just a glorified NES, you could basically hack games from overseas and basically sell them on this local consoles, which is what some of the companies within China did at the time. And while China did begin to open up more and more to the rest of the world later due to the efforts of its other future leaders, what this tariffs initially led to was that during the boom of consoles within Japan and most other parts of the world, during the period of the boom of PC games as well as MMOs within Korea, China didn't really have access to a lot of this, because the only way you could really get access to all of this content from overseas was through the black market instead. It was difficult to get your hands on all of this, and the lack of accessibility to all of this content would also make it more difficult for locals to then reproduce all of these games, or even produce it at scale at a level which would be competitive with game companies overseas, simply because they didn't have full access to the tech that they were working with to produce the games on, and they just didn't really have access to what competitors overseas were doing, and therefore it's a lot harder to gauge and therefore produce something that would be as competitive with that, especially when you don't really have any of those competitors to the same extent back home. So you could say that the industry for a long time was fairly restricted and within its own bubble. Though within this bubble, it would also seem that while in initial years you did see people trying to produce their own consumer titles as well, those didn't really stay for very long, simply due to the fact that piracy was also starting to flourish within the country when it came to games. After all, when a large part of the market is basically already playing games illicitly, trying to get hack copies from overseas, or trying to hack those games to then play it on their own local consoles, you can imagine that there would be a lot of people who would then be either selling bootleg copies of games on the market to try and earn a quick buck off of it, or they will be trying to hack these things themselves just so that they could be able to play these things for free. Kind of like what happened with the PSP back in the day, where it actually got to the point where you didn't even really need to go over to someone and basically acquire the hack games from them. You could just get your PSP modded and just download games off online because of the fact that the piracy on the console had just flourished to that extent. As a result, because of the fact that anti-piracy measures, as we still know today as well, they have never been effective and they never will be, because it basically is just a never-ending arms race to try and prevent people from doing this. The companies, the game developers within China basically went in another direction, where instead of trying to stop people from pirating games, they basically created games where you simply wouldn't be able to pirate if you wanted to play it, which, yeah, it's basically through live service games, and that was what resulted in the drive for live service games like MMOs and mobile games to start to flourish within China as well. And it will be here where the industry would start to flourish, starting with the current megacorp that owns half the world's entire game industry at this point, Tencent. So for those of you who are wondering, no, Tencent wasn't started by some dude McBroson on the side of the streets who wanted to make his own new cool hip game about galvanized square steel or something. Rather, it was actually a tech startup which started by making a messaging service, which was then followed by going to mobile data service provision, and they got really wealthy doing it. Using that money, they then began to license games from overseas that they would then bring into China, something that is still quite heavily restricted till this day. For those of you who don't know, basically China has a restriction on the number of games from the rest of the world that can go into China, and it's almost virtually impossible to get your game in without the help of some of these major Chinese companies who have ties to the Chinese government as well. This applies blanket across to all games, and so typically what games get in and what don't would depend on who you knew within the space to be able to help you get your games in. And it's within this space where Tencent initially basically went in, bringing in some of the coolest games that existed out there, Korean MMOs. Because we're talking about live servers only. This did decently well for them, and being the mega corp that they were, in around 2007-2008, as things started to get a little more relaxed in terms of what companies within China were allowed to do, and they got a little more economic freedom as well, Tencent basically started to invest in game companies overseas as well. And it was around this time where they actually purchased about 20% of the stock of Riot Games. This would expand slowly
till it got a majority stake in
2011, which would basically happen after they got what was essentially a monopoly with the messaging app WeChat within China. 2008 was also the year when NetEase would start bringing in games from Blizzard into China, such as World of Warcraft, which basically ensured that the Chinese population too could basically become cripplingly obese, grinding on balls for 21 hours a day. 2011, the year we just mentioned before, was also the year that MiHoYo would be founded. So the reason why I'm bringing this up is because of the fact that the Chinese game industry really did see rapid growth at the time. Because when it comes to games prior to this period, we really don't see much, if at all, of the games that were produced within China at the time. And that is with good reason, because you really didn't see much in terms of games that were competitive with what was coming out from Japan or Korea at the time at all. And so going from a period where you really didn't see much in terms of games getting out of the country to suddenly 10-15 years later being basically fairly dominant within the industry overall. But with Tencent itself, even though they don't really develop games, owning close to what is half of the global game industry, what happened, right? The answer to that is simply, well, maybe it may not be that obvious to some people initially, but so for those of you who went through a course on business administration in university and who weren't high on alcohol for half the course like I was, you would probably remember some of the classes where they actually did talk about things such as ways that a company can try to suddenly expand into a market that it had zero competency in initially if it wanted to diversify what its product offerings were. Of course, there are many ways to go about doing it, but the way that Chinese companies have been doing it, and this isn't something that is only exclusively to the game industry, is through mergers and acquisitions. We kind of see this happening in other industries as well, such as with the automobile industry. Hell, even in just the USA alone, Chinese companies are recorded to be doing about billions of dollars in mergers and acquisitions every single year. Like this isn't like a cumulative billions up till now, but it's been consistently within the billions for years on end at this point. This is also something that is actively supported by the Chinese government itself as a way to quickly get into markets and basically acquire the knowledge needed by acquiring another company that has been in the industry for a while to basically allow them to build up their base quickly. And it is something that happens in the game industry as well, as it is mentioned in a speech by the regulator of the game industry, Song Jian-sin, who also spoke briefly about the existence of a overseas promotion fund to help Chinese games to expand quickly across the world. That and having a large local population that is basically free game if you're a local company to be able to reach out to and target, and with how big and how much the industry or the space itself actually spends on games, you do have a large space where companies can get a huge amount of funding from creating games, especially if the games do sell well, and that will allow them to basically continue to fund the creation of titles going forward at a much larger pace than, let's say, if you had a Japanese game that was only released in Japanese, which did happen quite a fair bit back then. Point is, these Chinese publishers, especially with all the companies that acquired globally and how much influence they have back home as well, have basically access to vast amounts of information to be able to observe the trends within the industry and to be able to better understand what works and what doesn't quickly, because they can look and observe the operations of game studios across a much wider range of firms, so as to then figure out how best to not only help each of these individual firms to improve, but to then also help local firms back home to improve at a quicker pace as well, thus allowing local developers to basically skip some of the growing pains that would initially come from the growth of the industry, as they basically have knowledge and access to what the rest of the world has done, not just through observing what the companies do, like what a journalist would do basically, where they just use external sources to observe a company, but because they own the company, they can look at all of the internal processes as its owner and use all of that to basically get first-hand knowledge to better improve all of the firms that operate under them. On top of that, China being the big hype thing to invest in that had been for a very long time prior, many companies had chosen to invest more into China as well, even within the game industry as well, and this basically gives them even more opportunities to grow as well. Sony and Microsoft, who actually decided to go into China and set up incubator programs there to basically help to develop the newer talent within the country. Mind you, Sony, a Japanese company that did not bother to do the same thing within Japan. Like, they would sooner go to China and set up a incubator program there to develop the Chinese youths there than to build one at home. So not salty at all, mind you, okay? Not salty, but you kind of can see the level of priority that companies were putting into developing the Chinese game industry as well. And as a result, while growth prior to 2010 was fairly slow, what we do see is that because of all of the acquisitions, the rapid rate at which they were basically gaining competency within the industry, the Chinese companies were basically able to rapidly develop. And I'd say that a large part of what made all of this possible is really just due to how big the domestic market back home is, where basically the huge market that they have allows companies there to basically expand to much greater scale than many companies outside might be able to. And using that money well, they basically invest in acquiring other companies to then learn better from them and use that to basically expand their position, not so much as a developer per se for the big companies like Tencent and NetEase, but as a publisher and as the parent company of a huge number of studios. That, and when it comes to project management, they're actually a lot more well-versed using agile management systems instead of the old top-down systems that are very popular within Japan. Basically, the difference between using a system that plans schedules as well as does job delegation using a more bottom-up approach as compared to having people at the top micromanage everything. This focuses a lot more on people at the ground level, giving them more decision-making power in terms of trying to figure out who within the team would work best at a specific job based off of everyone's knowledge within the team through active discussion, reflecting on the process on how it went, basically in terms of how well everyone did their jobs, why things didn't work out or why they did, and then therefore figuring out as a team how best to deal with potential future problems, and then trying to figure out what can also be improved. This is not to say that the top-down management that Japan uses is just not able to work altogether. We talked at large about how it used to be something that helped the industry at its very start, back when people were a lot more experienced and teams were a lot smaller in general. The thing is, there was that one artist on Japanese Twitter who was talking about like how, oh, Japanese companies, they don't comprehend the scale that Chinese companies work at. They just don't see how many people are working on those titles. And as someone who has spoken to people within Tencent, that's not actually true. The triple A's, some of the titles that they make do actually get to that scale. But the big difference, I feel like, is the level of efficiency that both of these countries have shown when they are working at that scale. You have companies like with Kingdom Hearts 3 with under Square Enix, and you have Blue Protocol under Bandai Namco, which did have massive teams. The issue is that they didn't manage to recoup, in part because they had a huge team and they took too long to develop the titles simultaneously. And it feels like it's due to all of this that we kind of saw a period a few years back where many Chinese companies were coming over to Japan and they were basically hiring veterans from all of the big companies to go over to work for them and build a studio under them instead. Although we did see a disproportionate number of those studios actually close down instead in the end, kind of like with Oka Games as well, but I feel like it has a lot to do with the inefficiency of the Japanese management systems and a partial mismatch with the way that Chinese companies manage their systems instead. And I've actually sat in and looked at some of the meetings that Tencent has had with some of their other subsidiary companies. And there's always that mismatch because of the fact that they're always trying and figure out the scheduling systems or like how long it would take for the project to develop from the Japanese company. But while Tencent is trying to use an agile system, asking them to basically give them all of the details of things like the sprints that they're going through, the Japanese company simply does not have that data because most of them are still using a Gantt chart and they're basically getting someone at the top to plan out the entire schedule in its entirety rather than having it work within spots that can be easily tracked instead. And with a lot of the veterans that they do hire, it does feel like many of them are just simply too used to the Japanese style of development and too used to having basically actually even more talented people on top of them doing all of this micromanaging, which once again, I don't think it's impossible to do, but you really do need extremely talented people to be able to do it, and most of the talented people who are good at doing it have been doing it for a long time, and that in a way has deprived all of these people below them of the opportunity to also be able to manage. And so when they become veterans and they leave to form their own studio instead, they don't really have the talent in terms of actually managing the studio, or in some cases it just simply is the case that the techniques or the skills that they have just aren't as efficient or relevant in this modern day, which basically causes them to misgauge things quite heavily while developing their own title, and is what led to some of the studios ending up closing down instead. That said, when it comes to the Chinese game industry, we also cannot ignore the fact that they have also enjoyed a lot of success, in part because of the economic situation the country has been until this point. And what I mean by this is that the reason why they have been able to expand as easily and as quickly as they have, and why they have been so successful and able to participate in the whole M&A game to basically expand themselves, is in part due to the economic situation that the country is in and that they have managed to enjoy from being a company that was initially grown out of this country. So explaining this is going to be a little tricky because of the fact that the points I'm about to bring up here, all of them are intertwined in a way, and each of them in isolation may not make as much sense, which I feel like that kind of makes sense. Things typically aren't so simple, especially when things have quite a fair bit of history into them, that they would just be easily explainable through just one point alone, right? The reason why I'm this weird dude on the internet now, talking to you guys in front of a camera, is not just because I was dropped on my head as a kid, but because of the fact that I was also raised in a very weird society, I guess, where people told me I was a failure for not being able to become a doctor and all of the repressed trauma that came with that, which is not important to this video. But either way, if these points were taken in isolation, I feel like not only would it make a lot less sense, but it would also skew the point of the video to some extent, because people would then start to write me off as either being pro or anti-China, when what I'm trying to do here is to look at this as objectively as possible as to what has caused the country to be where it is at this point. So if you're interested in this section, I urge you to listen to everything that I have to say before actually coming to your own conclusions about all of this. So when it comes to the economics of it, what makes the game industry as successful as it is also in part what makes the country as successful as an export-oriented nation that it has been up till this point, which is the fact that the country does have a fairly intentionally weakened exchange rate. as well as a much lower cost of living as compared to some of the nations in the West in particular. And what this basically means is that every dollar that someone else spends on your weird Temu dildo that you made and sold overseas is actually worth a lot more when brought back to your home country. And so while something that you send overseas might look really cheap to those people, they actually are worth a lot more to the people within your country when it actually gets sold overseas to those people, because the money you'll get from them translates to a lot more spending power back home. And this is not something that is exclusive to China. The whole idea of intentionally keeping your exchange rate weak is something that across the years, the decades, many countries have done, especially those that have a more export-oriented economy, as it allows them to basically trade and make their goods more attractive to the countries overseas, due to the fact that importing the goods is a lot more affordable. There is also a balance that needs to be taken with that, because if you lower your exchange rate too much, all the things that you then import tend to be more expensive, because your currency is so weak that if you were to try to buy something from another country overseas that you might need, like raw materials for example, those raw materials would then be more expensive. So typically there is that fine balance that needs to be taken, right? Just because your currency is weakened doesn't just mean that you will earn more from exports all the way as a result. But the thing is, all of this on its own, this actually doesn't really mean that much. The thing is that even if you manage to sell your fake Temu Bad Dragon to some scaly in America, just because you earn a lot from that doesn't necessarily mean that the industry is going to grow as a result. In the end, it also has to do with how that money is then spent by the company and how it is invested back into the company to allow it to grow and for the industry to therefore grow as a result. Which, looking at the news that labor firms within the country have been putting out there, it would seem that at the very least that money seems to be going back into the game industry, into actually hiring better talent, because of the fact that it does seem like the average that people are earning within that industry is about up there with something as prestigious as banking or some of the top-end finance jobs as well. Which I know what some of you are gonna say, right? But Mr. Salaryman, most of the data coming out from there is a fake. You know, the country loves this fake data, and some people are then gonna in the comments probably like fire back and be like, yeah, but every country fakes their data or something. No, okay, it doesn't really matter whether or not they actually fake the data, because the thing is that even if we assume that the actual pay is somewhat lower than what is stated here, like let's say for example, we don't trust the article itself and we say that they actually earn less than what is stated there, that actually still means that these people are actually being paid significantly lower in terms of if you were to convert it into something like the US dollar, for example, as compared to someone in Japan, because they are basically earning somewhere about half of what a person on average within the game industry in Japan earns. Which basically means that if you assume that every country has about an equal proportion of people who are talented in a specific thing, with the money that you have earned in America and brought back to your home country, the person who lives in China can then use that to fund the hiring of 2 people where Japan can only hire 1 person. And this is before we take into account the fact that China has a massive homegrown economy as well, right? You have a country with 1 billion people, with a government that basically restricts the amount of competition that you can get coming in from overseas, meaning that you do exist in a market that is way bigger than what most countries have as their own home field, and you have much easier access to that market than most other countries do. And therefore your market would tend to be less saturated than say Japan, for example, where most companies can just come in and release their games and it's fairly even game for all the companies that do. Overall, they are actually in a position where it's actually much easier for companies to actually initially grow and get big with less competition around, and then to then use that money to expand globally. And with the money that they earn from overseas, they can actually expand at a much quicker rate than a company in either Korea or Japan would, thereby allowing them to get a lot more talent, and this allows them to expand more massively. I actually knew someone who used to work in the Tencent branch within China on PUBG Mobile before they actually came over to work in Koei Tecmo in Japan. It was a very bizarre situation that they even chose to come over in the first place. And we actually did speak to them about their time in Tencent back in the day. And what we learned is that while they were working there, if you were to convert their pay, which is actually a fairly good living wage within their country, over into something like the Japanese yen, for example, they were earning less than half of what we did. But the big difference that actually exists here is the fact that while their pay may not seem like a lot on paper, they're actually being compensated way better than people in Japan are. And this is not something that is new either. We have seen articles come out in the past as well, where people have talked about, news articles have talked about how animators who work in a Chinese company within Japan are actually being paid significantly more than animators working for the animation industry within Japan as well. And the thing with this guy from Tencent that I spoke to is that while his base pay was half of mine essentially, when you factor in the exchange rate, unlike the company I have, or actually all of the companies I've worked for in Japan up to this point, no matter how successful the company has been, I don't think I've ever seen myself ever receive a bonus as big as he did, because his yearly bonus at the time when PUBG was at its peak was basically 13 months. Not a 13th month, mind you. He got 13 months of additional bonus. Basically, when you factor in all of the bonus he gets for the year, his pay actually equalizes with mine, even in terms of like after the exchange rate. So basically, he's able to live a very lavish life within his country with the type of pay that he was getting as a result of the type of compensation structure that they had. Yeah, it's a lot stricter there. Yeah, if you perform poorly, you're actually going to get fired, unlike in Japan. Yeah, it is a lot more difficult of a life, I would imagine, as well, since the number of work hours that they have are also longer than the ones I have in Japan. And in fact, the reason why he chose to come to Koei Tecmo in the end was because of the fact that he was tired of the stress he was getting there, which is actually kind of worrying about like the actual motivations he had for coming to a Japanese company in the first place, and what it kind of gives off as an image of the Japanese game industry compared to China's. But point is, I shouldn't be complaining about him coming to Japan to slack off when we were basically drinking in the company past work hours on some of the nights as well. Point is that they do have a much better compensation structure, which I think is something that honestly it does feel like they took a lot more influence from the West over. And this is not the only thing, because as we mentioned before, the massive amount of M&As that they have done, especially within the West, within America, within Australia, within Europe as well, have given them access to a lot of how the work culture is in many of these countries, where unlike in Japan, you tend to focus more on performance instead of seniority. And so things like if the guy fucking sucks at his job, you fire him and you just drop his ass is a lot more common. And the thing is that if someone is highly successful, they're also quicker to reward them to ensure that they are able to keep that talent, be it in terms of paying them more or giving them a quicker promotion so they can rise through the ranks quicker. That, and while China has made many very impressive strides so far, it's also true that we're starting to see some level of a slowdown with this as well. While when games like Genshin Impact, when it first came out, being a full 3D open world live service title in the way that it was kind of impressive, we're starting to see more and more companies basically following in that style, and we're starting to see that while there are a lot of very high quality Chinese games coming out of the country, they are all to some extent slowly starting to feel more same-ish. And what this is basically doing is it's also gonna cause the industry to therefore as a result see some level of saturation. Because while yes, you can create something within that space that targets a very unique audience, eventually bit by bit, the different spaces that you can reach out to are slowly being covered, and as those places get and those markets get more and more competed over, we're gonna eventually see a point where all of these companies that are coming out with their similar-ish titles that are basically trying to be similar to that one big successful thing, kind of like with what happened in Japan, where people looked at the thing that was successful and tried to make things similar to it. Depending on how that goes, it can actually lead to quite a lot of damage to the industry as well for China, because of the fact that, realistically speaking, they are investing a lot more into these titles, and to be fair, that's probably why they are succeeding now. But just as it is part of what made them look so much better than many of the Japanese games that they were competing with, especially in the live service space, it is also true that this means that if the title fails, the company takes a much bigger financial hit than the Japanese company would have. As the market starts to saturate, we might see potentially, depending on how the Chinese market develops, more of that playing into what is already safe, which is already in a sense what's happening now with this type of games, some of them at least that are coming out of the country. Although we do see that the companies, the bigger ones especially, are actually quite looking into expanding and trying to tap on all of the newfound competencies that they're starting to see rise within China to develop more interesting titles in the future. So we might see a little bit of both, where within certain spaces, or we might actually start to see some companies eventually reach the point where they start to buckle under their own weight. But with some of the others, perhaps they'll be actually able to create something that will actually stand the test of time and be uniquely remembered as why Chinese games or games developed within China actually managed to become as popular as they did for what they are today. Today, we live in a world where many of the top, especially live service games, are basically being managed by Chinese companies. Some even like MiHoYo, for example, all their games were developed by a Chinese firm. We do see many other titles as well in the live ops space, right? Like Wuwa, Strinova. They are producing many games that are coming out in the space that are doing pretty well. And it's no longer just in live service as well. Like I've spoken to people within Tencent about how things have been progressing within the Chinese game industry. And it's not just them, but just Chinese game developers and these massive publishers as well are starting to gain confidence in the ability for Chinese companies to actually produce consumer titles as well. And this all happened because of the fact that, and I know that this game, like people either really love or hate it, which is Black Myth Wukong, right? Because it did so well, companies such as Tencent have now looked at it and started to feel like there actually is a viable market for consumer titles being developed within China to do well, and are looking to actually invest more into consumer titles within China as well. So the idea of up till now, they have rapidly expanded and improved and have come to top the live service space. And there are still people huffing copium saying like, yeah, but they're just in live service, who cares? They are slowly improving and trying to expand into consumer games going forward as well. Now, needless to say, whether or not they would be able to succeed, it's really hard to say for certain. If things go on current pace and the companies are allowed to do whatever the fuck they want with the amount of support from the government that they have, yeah, for sure they probably would be able to reach it at some point. But from what we know so far, their government tends to be very fickle, let's just put it, where they can basically suddenly just have a conniption in the brain and decide that like, yeah, you know what, we're gonna tank the stocks of all of our like massive game publishing companies out there in like one day by just saying one line, and then after looking at the fact that they dropped by 20%, we're then gonna backtrack on everything and say like, you know what, I don't think we actually want to cause that to happen. So like the government has a lot of power to very easily censor as well as restrict what the game industry in China can do. And we do see this to some extent with the types of restrictions that used to exist in the past. Prior to, well, like it kind of changed in the last few years, but if you go back maybe like 5 years, for example, you would notice that most when it comes to a little bit of like Guna or loot content within China, it tended to be very heavily restricted, right? You look at games like Blue Archive, you look at games like Azure Lane. Azure Lane has some of the most like wow fucking looking censorship that happens in China where they do stuff like this. I feel like this makes it even worse, but I guess they are complying with the censorship laws that exist within China. So like, well played. It feels more like a meme lot tactic, if anything, but that's not important. The fact of the matter is that it used to be a lot more strict with a lot of that, which is also why you see that the earlier titles that MiHoYo made, there was a period where they were going in that direction, and then they suddenly went full wholesome chungus for a little, and then they went back into this direction again. It's in part because of the fact that many things within the Chinese government, it's like a cyclical cycle of like fuck around and find out, where people, you know how they like to make the meme with the loop and then like shit always goes wrong eventually. That's basically what happens there. And so you do tend to see that like their government, sometimes they can be the most supportive, and I feel like that's part of the reason why they do so well, but sometimes it can also cause it to be heavily restricted and lose some of its competitiveness. So we'll have to see going forward, as we do know from some of these old speeches that the Chinese government has come out and said that they do want to continue to push for some level of censorship in what can be talked about in the games that are produced by Chinese companies and that are produced by companies under their Chinese companies as well. Overall, I would say if you left things on their own devices as they are now, and these companies were allowed to develop in the way that they are, I feel like it wouldn't be difficult for them to overtake a large part of not just Japan and Korea, but a large part of the world's industry, simply because you have companies there that already own half of the world's games industry. they have a huge domestic market that realistically only they have access to, and they actually enjoy far more government support than firms within Japan and Korea too. With Japan only like in the last 2 to 3 years finally seeing the government maybe warming up to the idea to some extent, and Korea only seeing something in the last 5 years as well, if I'm not mistaken. So we'll have to see. Depending on how things go forward in the future, we could see them do very well, or we might see it peter out a little, but I don't think they'll be disappearing anytime soon. That said though, like after making this video, or I guess before, in order to make this video, I actually did a lot of research on all of these countries and all of their game industries. And it's not just these three, but like even the entirety of like Southeast Asia as well. I've played some Vietnamese games, I've played some Indonesian games. Like Coffee Talk was really good, in my opinion. Fairy Afterlight was also really good. There's also a horror game coming from Singapore called Scarred, which actually looks pretty interesting, I have to say, as someone who has stayed there for a decent part of his life. Countries in the region that I didn't even really expect much from their game industry. Like as someone who actually did work in like Singapore's Koei Tecmo branch for a while, you know, the atmosphere there was always just like so depressing. Like most people were like, yeah, in Singapore we really don't have much of a game industry. We really just don't see much coming out. There's that one company that makes like cat games that like gets into drama a lot, and it's like seen as like a joke by half the industry in Singapore. But like you see all of that, and then nowadays you start to see them pop up more as well. I look at all of that, and then I look at all the people online who are constantly bickering about like, my Korean game better than your Chinese game, China #1, all of that, and it starts to feel like just really cringe overall. Even in the current company I'm working in now, developing games, it's like it's made up of people from Japan, well, obviously, as well as people from China, people from Korea, like people from all over the region working together to develop games. And the fact of the matter is that, in a way, everything in this industry, it's like thinking of it in isolation, in my opinion, isn't a very good way to go about it, because countries have influenced each other in the development of their respective game industries for such a long time. It's not like Japan was the one influencing the entirety of the region or something like that. Korea made some really good games. Those really good games got brought over to Japan, and those then influenced the way that the Japanese industry also evolved, right? The idea of gachas as a monetization system within all of these live service games wasn't a Japanese concept. It was a Korean invention that used a Japanese concept, the term gacha, as a base to basically form something that they would then market first in the Japanese industry. The Japanese industry would look at this, see how well it works, and then start to use it in their mobile games. And as the mobile game market started to proliferate, the people in Korea and China as well, as the adoption of smartphones became more of a thing within their countries, saw that there was a market there as well, and you could basically use the Japanese games that exist as a base to then make something that was even better. Both have arguably made much better quality games than many of the games that came out of Japan prior, using art styles as well as themes that kind of are reminiscent of it to some extent. And now, even at the workplace, when I'm working with others and like I listen to people talk about the titles that they are developing, right? People who talk about developing mobile game titles are basically using Korean and Chinese titles as a base of reference to basically say, yeah, we could try doing this, but let's do it better, Like people within the region have always, in my opinion at least, maybe you could consider me perhaps a little naive, but it does feel like for the past 20, 30, maybe even 40 years, companies in the space have just been influenced by each other. And it's actually, to me at least, it feels like pretty fair to say that like, if any of these countries just operated in isolation, I don't think they would have gotten to where they have gotten, right? Lies of P, the developer himself, talks about how his favorite Souls-like game, right, that the term coming from a Japanese game as well, was Legend of Zelda, which is also a Japanese game. People gain influences from each other, and they use that to then produce something that is even better. Because now that you know what works and what doesn't in the space, you can then work towards improving it even more. So, I came into this video thinking a lot more about like, why is Japan not doing well? Is that a bad thing? Is it a good thing? Like a lot of the negativity and like frustration with why we are just suddenly losing out in a sense. But the more I studied about all of this, the more I understood the flow of the development of games, the history of it over the past 40 years within the region, I actually feel less like worried. I feel less like troubled and frustrated because it does feel like everything in a sense happens in a cycle that constantly improves what exists around us. Eventually, people make a thing, and as it does well, they get complacent, and someone else somewhere in a industry or perhaps in a space that isn't as affected by the trappings of the industry comes in, displaces what currently exists, and new companies who want to try to enter the space will look at these things that overtook those games and then improve upon them, and it just goes in this ever like never-ending cycle. I can't say all of like Asia because that's a very broad term, but like East Asia, we talk about China, Japan, Korea, the big companies within the space right now. I do see like Korea overtaking Japan in certain spaces. I do see China doing the same as well, and I do see it being really possible for them to take this to the next step and further displacing Japan, especially if Japan remains complacent the way it has been for a long time. But if the Japanese game industry, if the people at the top manage to finally reflect on what went wrong and try to improve their companies for the better, maybe they retire to a farm somewhere, and the younger people who take over after them will finally be able to push for more of these changes that these people didn't want to, and that will allow the industry to then jumpstart itself and get back on its feet and maybe even overtake China and Korea again, especially the word overtake at this point as something more along the lines of like a friendly rivalry. Perhaps some people might disagree with me on that point, but at the same time, these are countries which have had a much longer history in developing games than most people give them credit for, and they have basically been able to use a lot of the new trends and understanding of what exists out in the market to then produce something that is of better quality, and the continued cooperation to some extent, right? Like you look at like Bang Dream, for example, right? Ave Musica, not maybe not game related, but key visuals, some of it was done by Koreans and it works, right? The cooperation between the Japanese, Korean, and Chinese game industry, I feel like actually can lead to products being much better than having one country isolate itself and try to just produce things on its own while trying to ignore everything else happening around it. And hey, as someone who works in a studio where all of this cooperation actually is happening, I actually see it as a good thing. And maybe one day, rather than just arguing about which country produces the better games, right, we might reach a point where people are even more open to the idea of cooperation. And for all we know, it might actually allow for the industries within the region to get even better and maybe become even more of a force to reckon with within the global game industry space as a whole instead. But yeah, maybe that's all just my wishful thinking. I genuinely hope that one day we can actually reach that point, but we'll have to see based off how the Japanese, Korean, and Chinese game industry continue to develop going forward. That's it. That's all for the video for today, and I thank you all for watching. This was a very long one. I don't know if it's that interesting of a video, to be honest. This is something that I personally really wanted to make, in part for myself as well, right? To answer to myself, like, all of these, like, emotions I felt and have been feeling for a while working in the game industry in Japan. And in a way, I kind of did find the answer for myself. I hope that the message I'm trying to get across at the end here gets across, maybe. Maybe it's a little too, like, garbled in my brain, which is a little too optimistic, perhaps. But yeah, overall, this is how I feel about the game industry in Asia overall. One where we do see the trends being kind of true, not so much as what people online seem to believe, and not in the level of optimism that people outside of this country seem to possess about the countries themselves. But if things go well, we might very well continue to see these countries do well going forward for a long time to come. That's it. That's gonna be all for me for today. Thank you all for watching, and thank you to the people who have helped to support the channel till this point. It's really thanks to all of you guys that I can even like take the time to just like sit around and develop, or I guess like produce these videos while still having to like juggle working at the same time, and like the level of patience both the supporters, the backers, as well as you guys who just watch the video show, and the very haphazard and infrequent release schedule for videos here is something that I'm quite grateful for as well. So I thank you all so much for that. That's it. That's all for me for today. So until the next video, I'll be heading off for now. But till then, take care and bye-bye. And I didn't even hit the mic this time.